And they also need to trust us not to overreact. And what I tell teachers is you need to be the thermostat in the room. You set the temperature. You're not a thermometer. If you're the thermometer, whatever the kids are at, that's what you're going to reflect. So be the thermostat, not the thermometer. Kids need us to set that tone, especially children of trauma, but even the other students in the room. They need us to be the adult. They need us to be the safe space. They need us to handle the big pieces.
Welcome to the BJU Press Teacher Edition podcast, where Christian educators are encouraged and inspired as we bring you interviews, practical ideas, strategies, and answer your questions about teaching in today's culture. And here's your host, Jenny Copeland.
More and more, our students are coming to us with some type of experience or even an ongoing situation that's traumatic in their lives. Christian schools and their students are no exception. These traumatic experiences come in many forms, and for many students, they're hidden from those around them. But in spite of that, the impact is tremendous. From school performance to behavior to actual physical effects, students are dealing with the impact of what they have experienced. As educators in a Christian environment, we have an incredible opportunity to speak into their lives at such a time. But where do we start? How prevalent is this in our schools? And really, what can we do to help? We're going to be talking about answers to those questions and more in today's episode. As we kick off this episode, let me again start by welcoming each of you who are joining us. I'm so excited that each of you are listening in or watching. Thank you for making Teacher Edition a part of your day. Have you missed a few episodes in the busyness of life as a teacher? Well, take a few minutes while you vacuum your classroom, or maybe you're putting up a bulletin board, and go catch up on those episodes. As a reminder, each of those can be found on our website, teachereditionpodcast.com. In addition to each of those episodes, you're also going to find more great information about our guests, as well as show notes and more information about the podcast itself. You can also find us on social media. We are Teacher Edition Podcast on Facebook, Teacher Edition Pod on Instagram and TikTok. And of course, you can find us on YouTube as Teacher Edition Podcast. Okay, so let's talk about students. Well, I guess basically we do that every week here on the podcast, but let's talk about what they're bringing to our classrooms. So a few months back, Bruce Meyer actually talked with us about fear in our students. That was an excellent episode. Really helpful insights, great strategies. But what about trauma among students? So trauma doesn't always show itself, I guess we could say, in neon lights. It isn't the sweatshirt that shouts in big font that that person is hurting. It isn't always just a huge cast that tips off everyone to the fact that that student had an accident or something traumatic happened to that student. It can be silent. And with that, it can be really hard to identify. It can be hard to sift through. And it can be really hard to address. So I am really excited today to welcome Dr. Erin Yezbick to the show. Erin has been an educator for over 2 decades, and she has a passion for helping educators best meet the needs of this generation of students. More than that, she specifically has a heart for students with traumatic experiences in their lives. She's taken that next step even to better herself and better prepare herself to be effective in reaching those students. She's an ACE Master Trainer for the state of South Carolina. She's an assessment specialist through James Madison University, and she's also a grief recovery specialist. She also serves as a consultant, a research designer, and she does professional development for Christian schools. So that's actually my connection to Erin. A fellow educator actually had the opportunity to hear Erin speak and really recommended that we bring Erin on the show so that others could learn from her as well. So Erin, I am really excited for what you have to share with us today as we talk about trauma in our classrooms. So thank you so much for being willing to be here.
Well, Jenny, thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate the chance to talk with you about trauma, which is a subject that is near and dear and a passion of mine to help students who've experienced it. So thank you for this chance to talk with you about it today.
Yes, thank you. Okay, so let's start with ACE. So education is full of acronyms, and this is one we're certainly hearing more and more these days. So lay a foundation for us. What are ACEs, as we call them?
Okay, so ACEs is an acronym, or ACE is an acronym which stands for Adverse Childhood Experience. And this started in the late 90s, well, actually I would say mid 90s, in the medical field, where there was not really a coalescence of this idea, but some medical researchers were doing some work, some, longitudinal studies on patients, and they determined that patients who perhaps had a parent who was incarcerated, they had a tended to find that in patients who had heart disease or something along those lines. And so they thought, okay, well, let's do a study and figure out how prevalent this is. So as they tried to design it, they would say, okay, let's take a survey of all of our patients, and how many of you had a parent with a history of criminal behavior? And so they had a certain population of that. And as you do with any good study, you try to eliminate other variables that could affect it as well. And so they looked at it and they said, okay, well, if this parent had criminal behavior, what if it was assault? So maybe the mom was abused in the home, was physically assaulted in the home. Well, how do we differentiate that group of patients from patients who their parent was guilty of maybe a white collar crime? And so they kept digging into it. Well, if a parent has criminal behavior, maybe that child experienced neglect, and they just couldn't manage to eliminate all the possibilities for things that could be affecting the outcomes. And so in 1998, or, in the years preceding that, as they built this study, they decided, well, let's just take a larger look at it. Let's identify several things that are adverse childhood experience, is the term that we use now, and see if those pop up, if you will, in in these in these patients. And so they identified several different elements, and they ran the study, if you will. And in 1998, they published the study, and it's not an exaggeration to say this was a bomb that they dropped in the medical field. Some of the numbers that they came up with was that students who had experienced people who had experienced this, and again, they were studying children to adults, and actually, I think it was all adults, but people who'd had these experiences from birth to 18, if they had 4 or more examples of or experiences, they were more likely, they were 4 to 12 times more likely to have experiences with alcoholism, drug abuse, depression, suicide attempt. They were almost twice as likely to be dealing with obesity or severe inactivity. And you say, okay, well, those are all things that are choices. We can make those choices. But what they also found was a graded relationship. So the more of these adverse childhood experiences that you had, you are more likely to have adult diseases, including ischemic heart disease, cancer, chronic lung disease, skeletal fractures, and liver disease. And these in populations that did not have high risk behavior, such as drug abuse, alcohol abuse, and that sort of thing. So there was a clear relationship between these ACEs and poor health. So I often get asked, okay, well, then what are they? What are the ACEs? And they're typically broken up into 3 different categories. We have household dysfunction. That is typically, parental substance abuse, divorce or parental separation, mental illness. This might include like a suicide attempt, depression, that sort of thing, a battered mother or stepmother, or the maternal figure in the home, or again, criminal behavior. So we'll typically ask, did you, between birth and age 18, have a parent who spent time in prison? And that sort of question. The second category is neglect. And there's 2 types of neglect, which is emotional neglect and then physical neglect. And this neglect category can be interesting because it can surface in families where you wouldn't necessarily think it would be present. Because children, as parents with their busy schedule, and we're all busy, but when children are facing some difficult circumstances and they just don't feel that parental presence in their life, that can be emotional neglect. And then there's the category that we tend to think of when we think of adverse childhood experiences, which is the abuse, where these are actual things that directly affect a child. And so the 3 in abuse are physical, emotional, and sexual. And how we typically consider how this ACE grouping came to be is that those are all typically preventable. There can be interventions that prevent those from happening. And that's why things like death of a parent or death of a sibling don't appear on this list, because those typically aren't things that you can prevent death. So these would be considered preventable. So as far as the frequency of it, because this is what I get is, well, how often does it happen? Because this, seems like this is more related to, areas that I'm not in. And thankfully, 33% of the population, at least as reported by the study founders, if you will, the study authors, 33% of the population doesn't have an ACE, which is wonderful. And I'm thankful that we have such a high population that doesn't have to deal with this. Conversely, that's 2/3 of the population that does. So as you look around a classroom of 25 to 30 students, you can count on 16 to 20 of them will have experienced at least one ACE. And we found that 16% of the population, these are, again, the original study's numbers, have an ACE score of 4 or more. And that's what is associated with a higher risk of heart disease, lung disease, and that sort of liver disease. So it's quite prevalent in society. And interestingly, anecdotally, I used to work with student teachers at a Christian college or Christian university. And I asked that group of students, or we conducted a survey across that group of students, and 42 were in the room. 30 of them submitted their ACE score. So 12 of them, there's, no explanation for why they chose not to submit it. We don't know. They may have had other things to do. They may have put their gum in the paper. We don't know. It may have been too much to talk about, but 30 of them submitted their score. Now, again, a Christian university, and many of these students coming out of homeschool or Christian school backgrounds. And out of the 30, 16 of them, so over half, identified their ACE score as 5 or higher. So to the question of whether this affects us in Christian circles, 16 out of 30. So it's a pretty high percentage that deals with this, even in Christian circles. They're sitting in our classrooms.
Okay, so my next question actually is something that you started into a little bit. So you talked about household dysfunction, you talked about neglect, you talked about abuse, you've talked about 2/3 have had it. You did a study with college students. Okay, so when we hear these types of things in education, this terminology or these situations, we as pre-college educators, or maybe just educators in general, tend to categorize whether or not that applies to the Christian school or to Christian school students. So you talked about what ACEs are, and I think it'd be easy for us as Christian educators to assume that's something that public education is facing. It's not something that Christian students from Christian schools, coming to Christian schools from Christian families, would have faced or would be facing. So fact or fiction, talk with us more about ACEs and really how they are affecting Christian schools.
Well, it's interesting. The Christian schools will have me come in and just do, some continuing ed credits for them, or do their in-service with that sort of thing. And in one case, in fact, one of the earliest presentations that I did, and this was well before I was certified in this topic, but a Christian school had me come up and do a couple of in-services for them. And they've just put out an email to everybody on staff, exactly, and said, we're having this trauma training. That's how they labeled it. It was trauma in the classroom, which is a term I typically use in presentations. So trauma in the classroom, come to it if you're free at 7:30 in the morning. I think we did it. And so the head of maintenance for this particular school came into that session, and, in his mind, this was like a bloodborne pathogen or, some sort of accident. Emergency response. Maybe it's relevant to a lockdown drill, and as the head of maintenance and constantly on the grounds, this is something I should go to. So he came to the training expecting that and sat there, and I could just see his eyes getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And I know him personally, and I knew there was some difficulty in his background, but he said it was just so eye-opening for him. So here's this young man who spent much of his life either homeschooled or in a Christian school, graduated from a Christian school, went to a Christian university. He had a score of 9 out of 10 on the ACE scale. And when it was over, he came up to me. He said, I had no idea. I had no idea that this is what you're going to talk about. I'm thinking bloodborne pathogens, and here we are. He said, this explains so much about how I respond to things, about how I process information. And he said, it also explains why when I came to the Christian school in the ninth grade, he said, I didn't talk for the ninth grade. And I said, what do you mean you didn't talk through the quiet kid? He goes, they thought I couldn't talk. He just was
Wow.
so isolated into his own experience that he couldn't even pull himself out to interact with his classmates and with with the faculty of the school. So we see that with kids that are sitting in our classrooms. And what I find a challenge is that, in Christian circles, and very rightly so, we seek to see God's hand in our lives. And I think that is a huge help to these students. But there is a side of it that is not, it's unintentional. And it's that we want to see God's work in every situation we do in these situations, but we tend to pull away from talking about the negative. We don't necessarily want to track God through the bad things that happen. We don't look to that. We don't point to that. And so kids see that. And so they can, whether consciously or subconsciously, can take it upon themselves of, I can't talk about this
Right.
because that
Yeah. They
would not
suppress it.
be a welcome part of this conversation. And sometimes when they do, that they're not heard. So they're kind of almost brushed aside because we don't want to see that. As educators in Christian education, we don't want to see these difficulties. And sometimes, in church schools or ministry schools, especially, we're going to church with these parents. And so that can cause these to be hidden or not come to light for longer than they would in other circumstances. So again, there's so much virtue to the Christian school education, the Christian school experience, and the beauty that it can bring to life. But we also have to be aware that it can have unintended consequences as well. If
Right.
these kids are sitting in our classroom, the studies are showing us that there's no difference that a religious experience, and that's how secular
Sure. Yeah.
sources would look at it, but a religious experience, there's no correlation between that and a reduced ACE score. Kids who are coming out of a Christian background have the same likelihood of experiencing these things as kids who don't. Now, again, some of this is really big and looks really big on the surface, but a lot of times, regardless of secular education or Christian education, there are attempts to hide it. And so it can be difficult to spot.
Sure. Okay. So we've established what ACEs are. We've talked about how they're affecting Christian schools, just as they are public schools. But I don't think we can stop there. So I'm confident many of our listeners, as they're listening, they have the name or maybe the face of a student in mind. So what can they do? How can they accommodate students with ACEs in their classroom?
It's really funny. I just got a phone call yesterday as I was driving home, and it was, I had to laugh. It was, what was that study that you did? It was like a book study or a video that you watched about being a gentler parent was how it was
Interesting.
phrased to be.
Uh-huh.
What is that? Because I'm thinking of somebody that could really benefit from that. Maybe that, we could reach into their lives and provide this resource. I said, what, the trauma training? Oh, was that it? Yes, that was it. Uh, that what our students need, and this isn't just our children who have experienced trauma. This is not just the 2/3, but let's think about the world that our kids are growing up in now and the things that they're exposed to. And we actively seek to shelter them from the types of lifestyles that are openly flaunted in today's society. Um, but it's really hard because I can control for my own home, but I can't control for the child sitting next to them. I can't control for the things that they see as we drive somewhere. It's very difficult to shelter students universally from the exposures that they have. So, this sort of approach benefits every child in every seat, in every classroom. And so I often advocate for grace. And we want to have grace. We want to give children grace. We think we're giving grace, but we haven't necessarily accounted for all the things that they carry into the classroom with them, the things that come in their backpack, if you will, with them every day. Any child in any seat is going to benefit from a strong connection that accounts for the experiences that they have had. Sometimes you just have a kid that they feel like being ornery and they're going to do something stupid and they're going to say something dumb. And so that happens. But let's think about a kid who cheats on a spelling test. Why does a child cheat on a spelling test? Sometimes they just want a better score because they want a better score. But sometimes, if I'm dealing with discipline in a child, there might be more to it than I just want a better score. There might be parental expectations that they are not confident that they can meet. And so when they leave my classroom and they walk out with, it doesn't even have to be 70%. Sometimes it's an 80%. Sometimes it's a B. Sometimes it's an A minus. And they come home and they show that paper to their parent. And there are really ugly conversations that follow. And
Right.
there's difficult things that they face. Now, that does not at all negate how serious it is to cheat. We obviously
For
have to
sure.
address that.
Right.
We obviously have to correct inappropriate behavior. But what trauma training does for an educator is remind us that there are things that factor in that we need to account for.
Absolutely.
That if a child just does it because they feel like being unkind, they feel like bullying because they feel like they're better than some other child, that is different than a child who is behaving out of fear, out of a need for control. So a child who has a traumatic background, typically the last thing in life that they will give up is control because their life has been out of control for so long. So even if the outcome that I choose causes harm to me or causes harm to somebody else, I'm okay with that as a child of trauma because I got to choose it. And I know how that's going to end. And so this is where you'll see children who make holidays absolute misery because they're
Right.
terrified that they will be disappointed by the outcome. And so instead of not knowing when that disappointment will come, I'm just going to make sure that I guarantee it by December 15th.
Right.
That's
Yep.
my
It's
deadline.
in their control.
Um, and just as an aside, I know one family who has dealt with this in their children of setting their own disappointment where they've just said, hey, you want to come help me buy your Christmas presents? You get to see it. You get to pick the color. You get to pick where, what is, and I'll wrap it and you get to open it on Christmas Day. And there are no surprises because I know you don't like surprises. And so that's what they do. So the idea of empowering and connecting, correcting, these are not my ideas. These come from Texas Christian University and Karen Purvis, the Institute for Child Behavior at Texas Christian. But she developed these 3 different ways that we can help children. And the first one is empowering them. And this is helping a child to understand what triggers their trauma. And sometimes it can be really little, like they are a trooper through some really big things. And then 30 minutes later, the classroom gets a little loud during Heads Up 7-Up or whatever it is. Well, I guess Heads Up 7-Up, you're supposed to be quiet. But,
Yeah, that's the peaking. Yeah.
some game that you play in elementary school. And it gets a little crazy, a little wild. And they're triggered because that noise reminds them of the fight that mom and dad had last night. And so helping a child recognize that, I presented to a Christian school in the area a couple of years ago. And the choir teacher came up to me at church a few weeks later and she said, it's really interesting what you said, because a student came to me shortly after that session and said, I'm not comfortable with this song. Can I not sing this song that our choir is preparing? And the song was like just a really minor joking sort of argument. And I don't remember the exact context of it, but something like, I like coffee better than hot chocolate, or what, I like decaf better than regular,
Right.
whatever. But it was just a really
Seemingly
silly
minor.
little thing. But this student connected it to things that were difficult in her life
Wow.
because there was argument in it. And so my friend said, I just said, hey, not a problem. She said, normally I would have just said, you need to be in every piece. But she told the student, yeah, absolutely, you can sit this one out.
Yeah.
And so helping students identify what triggers them and then giving them the pieces that they need, the strategies that they need before they're triggered to be able to regulate their own behavior is one of the best tools we can give them when we empower them. And then connecting with them, which honestly is probably the first thing. We want that strong connection. What I encourage Christian school teachers, any teacher, is you want to have a safe classroom. And I think the safe classroom word is a really good, I want to say litmus test, but a really good example of how our way of thinking has to change. Because when I say, what is the safe classroom? What's your first thought when I say what's a safe classroom?
Right. You think of nobody's going to trip and fall, or, we know how to lock the door if there's an intruder.
Exactly. That's what we think of those
Yeah.
sorts of things. It's a safe classroom because no bad guys can get into this classroom.
Yeah.
There's no tripping hazards. We could even say things like, it's safe because we use kind words. And those are all examples of safe classrooms. So what is a safe classroom for a child of trauma? What is a
Yeah.
safe person for a child of trauma? And then the associated word, what is trust? So if I ask you what trust looks like, you would say, well, I wouldn't lie to you. I'm going to tell you the truth. And that's a very important part of trust, for sure. But for a child who is looking to be able to trust somebody, yes, they want to know that what you say is truth. But what they're really saying is, I can trust you with my emotions. If I'm having a really bad day, I want you there. And that's what's so funny about it is typically the teacher who is the safest for a child will often be exposed to the worst behavior because they know you can handle it. And you'll be
Right.
that
Yeah.
safe
Makes
space for
sense.
them.
Mhm.
So then, of course, we want to work on how we can reduce that bad behavior. We empower them with those strategies that help them to control their own behavior. But typically, the most trusted individual is the one who's exposed to the worst examples of a child completely losing control because they know this person can handle it. And they're
Right.
not going to completely lose it on me and melt down into my own meltdown. So they're trusted. They can trust you with their emotions. They can come to the desk and they can share really hard emotions. And I'll hear this sometimes from faculty. Actually, I just heard this a few months ago. A student, it was actually a college student, saw one of his professors and the professor said, hey, you look like you're down. He says, yeah, I'm having a really hard day. And that professor responded with, well, there's a lot of people in the world who would love to have the kind of life that you lead.
Oh, that was
Well,
helpful.
that's true. That is 100% a true statement. And that's exactly it. Was he trustworthy in the comment that he made? Yes. Was he trustworthy with the student's emotions? Not as much.
Right.
And so those are the kinds of things that students are looking for, that you're safe to be able to come up and they can say, I'm just really, really angry right now. Or their behavior demonstrates that they're really angry right now. And so that this teacher doesn't come back immediately while they're still in the middle of it with, well, Jesus doesn't like people to be angry. But that doesn't get to the root of what the problem is.
Right.
And so then when we say things like that, or a child has just dealt with a severe loss that to them is huge, is a really big deal. Because here's the thing, our emotions are fully formed at birth. Now, our reasoning, absolutely not. The brain centers for that don't fully form until 25. So that's where, to me, a loss is the loss of, a loved one is really big. And we would all as adults say, yeah, that there's a scale. And even children would probably realize that losing a parent or losing a
Sure.
sibling or that kind of thing is a much bigger deal than not doing well on a test. But we feel everything at 100%. There's no middle ground. We're going to feel it all. We're able to contextualize it very quickly. but kids not so much. So that's why when a child comes to me and says, I did not do well on this test and I now have a C in the class and I'm devastated by that. Or I lost my yo-yo and I'm devastated by that. And we say, that is not a big deal. That's not a big deal. There will be another yo-yo in your life. There will be another chance to ace that test. You're going to be fine. That's not what they need in the moment. And
Right.
we're not safe for their emotional state when we dismiss it as a trivial thing because they are in 100% emotions at that point, and we need to be safe with their emotions. And they also need to trust us not to overreact. And what I tell teachers is you need to be the thermostat in the room. You set the temperature. You're not a thermometer. If you're the thermometer, whatever the kids are at, that's what you're going to reflect. So be the thermostat, not the thermometer. Kids need us to set that tone. They need adults, especially children of trauma, but even the other students in the room. They need us to be the adult. They need us to be the safe space. They need us to handle the big pieces, which ultimately is where trauma breaks down because all of those preventable ACEs are where an adult could, and in many cases should have stepped in and didn't. And so a child is facing something that is completely overwhelming to them in the moment and do not have the tools for how to process it.
Thank you, Erin. That was excellent. And what you shared, just so many different ways we can help as Christian school educators. I especially like what you pointed out about being a thermostat. And we can do that for our students. All of our students need that, but especially those students who have experiences like this in their past. So what you have shared really raised awareness, I'm sure, with our listeners. And no doubt some educators are aware of students with traumatic experiences in their lives. But I'm also quite sure that what you have shared has made them think about some others who may just be suffering silently. They weren't aware of that in their background, and now they have that awareness. Most importantly, what you have shared has been from a biblical worldview, and that is what our students need most. They need to know that they are not alone. They are loved by us as their teachers, as their principals, but they also have a kind, all-knowing, all-powerful God who loves them individually and promises to be with them, to not leave them, to be everything that they need, and he can be that rock for them. They can run to him. In all of that, I just love it because we get the opportunity to speak that truth into their lives as educators. So Erin, thank you. That has been so helpful today. I really appreciate your time and your expertise, all that you brought to the discussion today. So thank you for that.
Absolutely.
Listeners, thank you also for joining us today. Erin has given us much to think on, and I hope you were challenged and encouraged. Just a reminder, go to teachereditionpodcast.com to learn more about the show and to submit any questions you have for upcoming episodes. Of course, be sure to subscribe to the podcast and follow us on social media. Now it's time to get back to your day. But once again, it's not just any day, because every day in the classroom is your day to impact and inspire through God's power and through his grace working in you. Go do what God has called you to do.